The winter of 1943 found Major Otto Grebner on the Eastern Front, where the brutal realities of war had worn down the strength of the German army. A man who had once stood tall among his comrades, respected and feared for his tactical brilliance, now found himself on the precipice of total collapse. The Soviet forces, relentless and unforgiving, had broken the Wehrmacht's offensive lines, leaving behind a trail of death and destruction. Grebner, once a proud officer who commanded legions with a mixture of intellect and willpower, now faced the most humiliating fate of all: defeat. In the days leading up to the battle that would seal his fate, Grebner had felt the tides of war shifting. The slow realization that victory was slipping from Germany's grasp had settled uneasily in his mind. His orders were clear: hold the line, no matter the cost. But he had begun to see the futility of this struggle. He could not reconcile his training, his experience, with the stark reality of what he was witnessing: thousands of men dying for a lost cause, leaders at the top of the Nazi regime deluding themselves into thinking their victory was still achievable. But despite these misgivings, Grebner remained a soldier, bound by duty and honor, though both seemed increasingly hollow. When the Soviet offensive hit, it struck with the full force of an unrelenting storm. Grebner's battalion was scattered in the chaos. The soldiers under his command, once so disciplined and resolute, now seemed like mere shadows of their former selves. Panic had taken hold, and many fled, abandoning their posts in a desperate attempt to save their own lives. Grebner, however, remained in his position, unwilling to let go of the vestiges of control that he could still exert. He ordered his men to hold fast, but the sound of Russian artillery, the crackle of machine gun fire, and the roar of tank engines quickly drowned out the strength of his command. The battle was lost. The major's own survival, a cruel afterthought in the midst of the carnage, became a pressing concern. By the time the order to retreat came, the front lines had collapsed. Grebner, along with the remnants of his battalion, began a disorganized withdrawal, the once proud soldiers now reduced to a haphazard group of defeated men. The landscape was littered with the debris of war, burned-out vehicles, shattered weapons, and the bodies of fallen comrades. The mud caked their boots as they trudged through the frozen earth, each step a painful reminder of the crushing weight of their defeat. The farther they retreated, the more fragmented they became, until Grebner was alone, lost in the chaos. It was here, in the depths of his humiliation, that Grebner was captured. A Soviet patrol, moving through the wreckage of the battlefield, spotted him as he tried to make his way toward a distant escape route. He had lost his weapon, his uniform was torn, and his face was streaked with grime and blood. To the Soviet soldiers, he was nothing more than another German officer to be paraded before the cameras of propaganda, a symbol of their hard-won victory. Yet, in this moment of despair, Grebner felt an odd sense of resignation. The war, which had defined his life for so long, was no longer something he could control, nor something he could escape. He was a prisoner, both of the war and his own pride. The Soviets handed him over to the British as part of an agreement to exchange prisoners of war. In this process, Grebner lost even more of his former identity. The very uniform that had once given him command now held no significance in the eyes of his captors. Stripped of his rank and his belongings, he was thrust into a British POW camp, a world that seemed as foreign to him as the battlefields of the Eastern Front had once seemed to the men who fought against him. The British soldiers, for the most part, paid him no attention in the beginning. To them, he was just another captured enemy officer, an embodiment of everything they had fought against. Grebner had expected to be treated as a war criminal, a symbol of the Nazi regime, yet what he found was far worse. His captors did not treat him with the bitterness or anger that he had anticipated. Instead, they simply ignored him. They did not mock him, nor did they praise their own superiority over him. In fact, their indifference felt like a cold slap in the face. In the early days of his captivity, Grebner found himself isolated from the other prisoners. The men in the camp had their own stories, their own hardships, and they did not seek to know the story of the man who had led German forces in the East. His presence was a reminder of the war, but nothing more. The British soldiers, having already endured their own suffering, seemed to have little sympathy for him. They regarded him with suspicion, but their suspicion was tempered by a sense of quiet judgment. Grebner was a defeated man in every sense of the word, and the British had no interest in giving him the dignity that had once been his right as an officer. Days turned into weeks, and Grebner's sense of self began to erode. In the cold, damp barracks where the prisoners were kept, the sounds of laughter, shouting, and camaraderie from the British soldiers reminded him of what he had lost. He could hear their conversations about family, about life before the war, about everything that existed beyond the wire fences of the camp. Their voices, filled with a strange kind of optimism, echoed in his ears as he lay awake at night, staring at the wooden beams above him. They spoke of things that seemed so distant, so far removed from the reality he now inhabited. But it was in the quiet moments of solitude, when the camp had settled into a strange stillness, that Grebner truly began to grasp the extent of his fall. The sharp sting of humiliation came not from the open mockery of his captors but from the absence of any real recognition of his existence. The British soldiers saw him as little more than a shadow, a fleeting image from a past they had long since moved on from. They did not hate him, nor did they pity him. They simply treated him with the same indifferent apathy that one might show to a discarded object, something no longer of use. In the solitude of his cell, Grebner's mind turned inward. He began to question everything he had once believed in: his loyalty to the Führer, his role in the war, and the value of the orders he had followed without question. He had been taught that duty and honor were paramount, that the soldier's role was to obey, regardless of the cost. But now, in the depths of his defeat, those very ideals seemed hollow. His honor had been reduced to a faded memory, and his duty had led him to a place where he was no longer a man of power or respect, but a prisoner like all the others. What had he really achieved, he wondered? His rise through the ranks of the Wehrmacht, his battlefield victories, his tactical genius, none of it had protected him from the consequences of war. In the eyes of the British, he was no more than another faceless officer, another cog in the machine of the Nazi regime that had caused so much destruction. His triumphs, once so intoxicating and filled with purpose, now seemed like fleeting moments of vanity. The men who had fought alongside him were dead or scattered, and his own identity had been reduced to a number on a prisoner list. It was in the midst of these painful reflections that Grebner began to realize that he had been wrong all along. The values he had held so dear had been nothing more than the tools of a regime built on lies. The respect he had once commanded had been the product of a brutal system of oppression. And now, in his defeat, he had nothing left but the stark truth. The war had been a battle for survival, for power, for ego, and for a cause that, in the end, had led him nowhere but to this grim and desolate camp. The man who had once stood as a symbol of strength had become an empty shell, left to confront the true cost of his choices. The days in the British POW camps stretched on with a lethargy that mirrored the growing sense of futility inside Major Otto Grebner's mind. The laughter of the British soldiers, once a mere background noise, became the soundtrack to his despair. He had expected, or perhaps hoped for, some form of anger or resentment, something tangible from his captors, but instead he was met with a strange sort of indifference. His once proud uniform had been taken from him, exchanged for a tattered, ill-fitting garment that marked him, quite literally, as nothing more than a prisoner. The insignia of his rank had been stripped away, leaving him unrecognizable not only to his captors but to himself. His identity as an officer, as a man who had commanded hundreds of men in the heat of battle, was erased. In the early days, Grebner did not interact much with the other prisoners. There was an unspoken hierarchy among them. Those who had suffered the longest had formed bonds, while newcomers were left to fend for themselves. The POW camp was a strange microcosm, its own ecosystem of survival, forged by men from different nations, all bound by the shared experience of war. The British soldiers, who had survived the brutalities of the North African campaign, the treacherous terrain of Italy, and the long years of fighting in France, saw in Grebner a symbol of their own survival. He was a figure from a past they had been fighting to forget, a reminder of the enemy they had once feared but had now subdued. At first, Grebner did not understand the nature of his treatment. His mind still clung to the idea of power, the sense of control that he had once wielded so effortlessly. He had been taught to believe that officers commanded respect, that their status was a reflection of their superiority. Yet, here in the camp, that respect was nowhere to be found. His fellow prisoners did not seek to challenge him, nor did they show any form of reverence. Instead, they ignored him as though he were a shadow in the corner of the room, something present but inconsequential. The silence that greeted him at every turn felt more stifling than any words of condemnation could have been. The British soldiers, too, kept their distance. They had little interest in engaging with him. His presence was a reminder of everything they had fought against, but he was not the enemy they had hoped to encounter. They did not see him as a villain to be vilified, nor did they see him as a symbol of their own victory to be celebrated. He was merely a man in uniform, a defeated soldier with no power left to wield. In their eyes, Grebner was no longer the proud officer of the German army but a broken man, forced to contend with the same vulnerability that had plagued so many of their own men. It was not long before the first hints of mockery began to emerge. At first, the ridicule was subtle, unspoken, a glance here, a gesture there. The British soldiers would mutter under their breath as he walked past, their eyes not meeting his but always darting to him as though they were sizing up their prey. Grebner had spent most of his life in the presence of authority, of men who deferred to him, who stood at attention when he passed. Yet, here in the camp, there was no deference, only the cold, casual indifference of men who had long since lost the sense of awe that once came with rank and power. Some of the other prisoners began to take notice of Grebner's isolation. They would approach him with curiosity, offering the occasional word of sympathy or commiseration, but most of them seemed too wrapped up in their own survival to make much of an effort. They were men from all walks of life, soldiers, factory workers, farmers, each with their own story of how they had come to be in this God-forsaken place. Some had been captured early in the war, others only recently. But they all had one thing in common. They had been broken by the war in ways that Grebner was only beginning to understand. There were a few moments, fleeting and rare, when a fellow prisoner would sit beside him, offering a word of quiet support. These were men who had seen their own families torn apart, who had watched as their comrades died on the battlefield, men who had suffered losses far beyond what Grebner could fully comprehend. They would share small stories of home, of the lives they had left behind, and Grebner would listen, his thoughts drifting back to the days when he, too, had once been surrounded by people who had respected him, who had admired his leadership. But now his thoughts were muddled, clouded by a deepening confusion. Who was he now? Was he still the man who had commanded the respect of his soldiers? Or was he merely another prisoner, a faceless individual in a sea of men lost to the ravages of war? As the days wore on, the mocking whispers became more pronounced. Grebner could hear it in the quiet laughter that echoed through the barracks. The British soldiers, having no real animosity towards him, began to find humor in his situation. There was something almost absurd about his presence. This once mighty officer, reduced to the status of a prisoner, nothing more than another casualty of the war. To them, it was a tragic but darkly comical reversal of fortunes. They would laugh at the way he stumbled over his new role as a prisoner, the awkwardness of his movements as he tried to adjust to his new reality. The laughter was not cruel, but it stung all the same. Grebner began to feel the weight of their mockery in a way he had never experienced before. It was not the hatred of an enemy seeking revenge. It was the laughter of men who had seen so much of death and suffering that they could no longer take the idea of heroism seriously. They had seen the futility of war up close, and in that futility, they saw something absurd about the notion of a man who had once held such power. His prestige, his rank, his victories, all of it seemed ridiculous now, reduced to nothing more than a faint memory. The mockery, instead of being an expression of anger, was a reflection of the soldiers' own disillusionment. They had fought for so long, seen so much destruction, that they could no longer see him as the villainous enemy commander. They saw only a man who had been broken by the very war he had helped perpetuate. But it was the silence that followed the laughter that cut the deepest. Grebner, who had always relied on the sharp lines of hierarchy to define his place in the world, was now confronted with a form of judgment that he could not easily navigate. The British soldiers did not hate him, nor did they care enough to mock him incessantly. Instead, they treated him as invisible. He was nothing more than another man in a camp full of men, all waiting for the war to end. There was no outrage, no attempt to exact vengeance. There was only a quiet acknowledgement of his defeat, a subtle recognition of the futility of their own fight and the weariness that came with it. It was as if the war had robbed them all of the capacity for genuine anger or hatred. Instead, they were left with indifference. This indifference, more than any amount of mockery, was what began to erode Grebner's sense of self. He had spent his life fighting for power, for control, for respect. He had always seen himself as someone above the common soldier, a man whose decisions had the weight of destiny behind them. But here, in the camp, he was just another man. His name held no significance. His past was forgotten, dismissed as irrelevant. He had been reduced to the lowest common denominator, nothing more than another prisoner, waiting for an uncertain future. As the weeks turned into months, Grebner began to grapple with the full extent of his situation. He had always believed that respect was something earned, something that could be demanded through force of will and the sheer weight of authority. But here, in the cold barracks, he began to see that respect, like everything else in life, was fleeting. It was a commodity that could be taken away as easily as it was given. The soldiers who had once bowed to him, who had followed his every order, were no longer present. The men who had once admired him now laughed at his misfortune, not with malice, but with a detachment born of their own war-weariness. In their eyes, he was no longer a man of power, but a man who had fallen from grace, just like so many others. And in that fall, Grebner found himself alone. The days in the British POW camp blurred together in an endless cycle of monotony. The sounds of guards marching, the distant hum of warplanes in the skies, and the muted conversations of prisoners seemed to form a soundtrack that played on an unbroken loop. For Major Otto Grebner, time had become something elusive, a strange concept that no longer held any meaning. His body had grown accustomed to the rigid, oppressive environment of the camp, its cold, its dampness, its pervasive air of hopelessness. Yet, despite the physical degradation he suffered, it was his mind that had begun to erode most rapidly. He found himself drifting between moments of clarity and moments of deep introspection. At times, he would catch himself staring at the same patch of wall for hours, wondering if he would ever escape the suffocating weight of his own thoughts. He had grown used to the cold, cruel indifference of the British soldiers. In the beginning, the mocking whispers had been the sharpest thorn in his side, but now he had come to expect them. Their laughter, once a painful reminder of his fall from grace, had become almost comforting in its predictability. They would make jokes at his expense, often at the most unexpected moments, their words sharp but never violent. Grebner's eyes would occasionally flicker towards the men, his gaze heavy with the weight of his own shame, but he had stopped trying to fight the ridicule. It was as though the soldiers had resigned themselves to seeing him as an object of some strange form of comedy. He was the living embodiment of defeat, a man who had once held power and prestige but was now reduced to a figure of derision, someone who no longer mattered. However, as the months dragged on, something began to shift. It started with the silence. It was subtle at first, just a few seconds here and there when the usual laughter would suddenly die down. The moments were fleeting, almost imperceptible, but Grebner noticed them. At first, he wondered if he was imagining it. He had spent so much time in the camp, surrounded by the noise and confusion of men trying to make sense of their predicament, that perhaps his perception had become skewed. But it wasn't just a figment of his imagination. There were real, tangible shifts happening in the atmosphere around him. It was as if the British soldiers, who had once treated him with the cold apathy of a forgotten enemy, were now beginning to view him differently. No longer was he the symbol of everything they had fought against, a mere piece in the great game of war. Now he was a man, and that change, however small, was enough to start a transformation within him. It began with an unlikely event. One evening, as the camp settled into its usual rhythm, a group of British soldiers gathered around a small fire outside the barracks. The air was bitterly cold, and the flickering flames seemed to provide little warmth. Grebner had been sitting alone near the periphery of the camp, his usual spot, where he could keep to himself and avoid attracting attention. He had learned to avoid the gaze of the other prisoners, preferring the solitude that came with sitting in the shadows. His thoughts, however, had been anything but solitary. In his mind, he had been replaying the events of the past years, the campaigns, the battles, the decisions that had led him to this place. He could see the faces of his men, some of whom had died fighting beside him, others who had fled in the face of overwhelming odds. And then, there were those who had been captured, like him. He could not remember a time when he had felt more alone. But that night, something in the air seemed different. As Grebner sat quietly, he began to notice the absence of sound, a stillness that seemed to descend over the camp. The usual banter of the soldiers, the murmurs of conversation and laughter, had all but stopped. It was then that he realized the group around the fire had fallen silent. The warmth of the flames flickered across their faces, casting long shadows on the ground. There was a palpable tension in the air, something unspoken. Grebner felt it as though the world around him had paused, waiting for something to happen. He stood up slowly, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on him, and walked toward the group. As he approached, the soldiers turned their eyes toward him. At first, Grebner thought it was just another moment of mockery, perhaps the culmination of some long-running joke at his expense. But then he saw something in their eyes, something that caught him off guard. It wasn't hostility. It wasn't indifference. It was something else, something he hadn't expected, respect. It wasn't loud or overt, nor was it something that could be easily identified with a single action. But it was there, in the way they looked at him, in the stillness that had overtaken the camp. The moment stretched on, long enough to make Grebner uncomfortable. The silence hung between them like a heavy fog, and in that silence, he realized something. These men, who had once viewed him with nothing but scorn, had begun to see him not as the enemy, but as a fellow soldier. A man who, like them, had suffered the ravages of war. The transformation was not immediate, nor was it complete. It took days, even weeks, for the shift in perception to fully manifest itself. But gradually, the interactions between Grebner and the British soldiers began to change. The mocking comments, which had once been a regular part of his life in the camp, became less frequent. There were still moments when the soldiers would exchange glances and whisper among themselves, but the sharp edges of their laughter were blunted. It was as though they had come to understand that, beneath the layers of uniform and rank, Grebner was no different from them. He too had been a victim of the war, just as they were. One morning, as Grebner was walking toward the mess hall, he noticed a group of British soldiers standing near the entrance, deep in conversation. They fell silent as he approached, but instead of the usual awkwardness or avoidance, there was something almost reverential in the way they regarded him. One of them stepped forward, offering him a small, almost tentative smile. It was a simple gesture, but for Grebner, it felt like a revelation. The man didn't offer any words, but the smile spoke volumes. It was as though, in that brief moment, the barriers between them had been broken down. He was no longer a faceless enemy. He was just another man, caught up in the same tragedy that had engulfed them all. As the days passed, Grebner began to engage with the other prisoners more openly. He would sit with them during meals, listening to their stories of loss, of families torn apart, of lives interrupted by the war. These men, who had once been so distant, now seemed to see him not as a symbol of their defeat, but as a man who shared in their suffering. They spoke less of strategy and tactics, and more of the personal cost of war. There were no more boasts about past victories or criticisms of the enemy. Instead, they spoke in hushed tones of the loved ones they had left behind, of the uncertainty of the future, of the small moments of grace they had experienced even in the darkest of times. And in those conversations, Grebner began to see a new side of humanity, one that transcended national boundaries, one that was born out of shared hardship. It was then that he began to realize the full significance of the silence that had fallen over the camp that night. It had not been a silence of contempt, but one of understanding. The British soldiers, in their quiet respect, had acknowledged the humanity of the man they had once seen as their enemy. They had, in that moment, offered him something far more valuable than mockery or hatred: dignity. The silence had been a recognition that war did not define them as men, that their pasts, however painful, did not have to dictate their futures. In that silence, Grebner had been granted the space to see himself not as a conqueror or a victim, but as a man who had endured the same suffering as everyone else in the camp. As the weeks turned into months, the camp's atmosphere shifted further. The soldiers who had once regarded Grebner with suspicion now greeted him with a nod or a quiet word. There were still moments of discomfort, of course, but the walls of animosity that had once defined his existence in the camp were beginning to crumble. It wasn't that he had earned their respect. It was simply that they had come to understand that respect was not something that could be measured by rank or military achievement. It was something deeper, something more human. In their silence, the British soldiers had given Grebner the gift of dignity. And in that gift, he began to rediscover the man he had once been, the man who had commanded respect not through force, but through the quiet strength of his humanity. The passing weeks in the British POW camp carried with them a sense of quiet resignation. The routine had become almost mechanical: the cold, the damp, the endless hours of waiting, the scarcity of food. For Major Otto Grebner, however, the monotony began to feel like a kind of odd comfort. He had come to understand that survival was not about defiance, nor about continuing to hold onto what was once his rank, authority, respect. No, survival was something more basic, more primal. It was about enduring. The months in the camp had begun to wear down the sharp edges of his pride. What had once seemed important, the title of major, the responsibilities of command, the weight of his uniform, now seemed distant, irrelevant. He had been stripped of his identity as an officer, as a man of power, and what remained was simply a human being, vulnerable and fragile, like all the others. But there was something profoundly liberating about this realization. In the silence that had fallen over the camp after the soldiers' initial mockery of him, Grebner had slowly begun to shed the burden of his past. The rigid structure of military life, the hierarchy that had governed his every action, had given way to something more fluid and uncertain. He could no longer rely on the expectations that had once been placed upon him. There were no salutes, no formalities, no demands for obedience. He no longer had to live up to the ideal of a leader, of a man who could command and be obeyed. In the absence of all that, Grebner began to confront a far more unsettling question. Who was he without those things? It was in these quiet moments of self-reflection, when the camp was at rest, that Grebner began to see the world in a new light. The men around him, the British soldiers and the other prisoners, were not just figures to be ignored or observed. They were men who had lived through their own versions of hell, each carrying his own burdens, each struggling with his own questions. They were no longer strangers to him. He had spent so much time focusing on his own suffering, on the weight of his failure, that he had failed to see that they too had suffered. They too had known the horrors of war. And just as he had been broken by the war, so too had they been, each in their own way. It wasn't that Grebner had been blind to this before. It was simply that he had been so consumed by his own experience that he had failed to consider the others. Now, as he sat in the common areas of the camp, watching the men play cards or engage in low conversation, he began to notice the small details, the way a man would pause before telling a story, as if weighing the cost of reliving it, the way another would clench his jaw, his eyes momentarily flickering with the pain of a memory too sharp to forget. These were the signs of men who had been broken and had learned to survive, not by clinging to the past, but by accepting that the future was uncertain, fragile. They had found a way to move forward, and it was this, perhaps more than anything, that Grebner began to admire. One afternoon, as he walked along the perimeter of the camp, a familiar voice called out to him. It was Lieutenant Rowe, a British officer who had taken a particular interest in Grebner's quiet demeanor. Rowe had been one of the first to break the silence that had surrounded Grebner when he first arrived, offering him a simple nod of acknowledgement. Rowe wasn't the type to make grand gestures or speak with grandiose ideas of camaraderie. He was a man of few words, but there was something about his manner that commanded a kind of quiet respect. He had seen the worst of the war, having fought in Africa and then in Italy. His eyes, like the eyes of many soldiers, were weary, haunted by the things he had witnessed. But unlike some of the others, Rowe never seemed to see Grebner as an enemy. Instead, he had treated him as another man, another soldier, whose fate was no different from his own. "Major," Rowe said, using the rank with a certain quiet formality, as he fell into step beside Grebner. "The men are asking about you." Grebner nodded slowly, unsure of how to respond. He had long since grown accustomed to the fact that the men in the camp had stopped seeing him as a symbol of the enemy. They had come to see him as something else, something closer to themselves. There were no more whispers behind his back, no more whispered insults. Instead, there was a kind of tentative respect, as if they were all bound together by some invisible thread, a thread woven from the shared experience of suffering and survival. "They wonder how you're holding up," Rowe continued. "There's talk of organizing a work detail, nothing too difficult, just some digging near the far end of the camp. They could use a hand. I thought you might be willing to help. No pressure, of course." Grebner considered the offer for a moment. It was not the kind of request he had ever expected from a British officer. Back when he was still commanding men on the front lines, any work detail was a way to assert power, to reinforce the hierarchy of authority. But here, in the camp, things were different. There were no orders, no expectations. The men helped one another out of necessity, not out of duty or rank. They had learned to rely on each other in ways that transcended the rigid structure of military life. Grebner had no obligation to help. Nothing in his past had prepared him for this new kind of interaction. And yet, something stirred in him. He had spent so long resisting the degradation of his situation, holding on to whatever shreds of dignity he could. Perhaps this was the moment to let go of that final piece of pride. Perhaps this was the moment when he could finally accept that survival wasn't about maintaining a facade of strength, but about embracing the humility of shared struggle. "I'll help," he said, his voice surprisingly steady. Rowe gave him a small nod of approval. "Good. I think it'll be good for you to be with the others. They've come to respect you, Major. Don't let that go to waste." As Grebner made his way toward the work detail, he was struck by how natural it felt to be among the men. The tasks at hand were simple, digging a trench to help with drainage, clearing debris, but as they worked side by side, something shifted in the atmosphere. The tension that had defined his early days in the camp, the cold indifference and veiled hostility, had all but disappeared. Now, as he worked with the British soldiers, he saw something else in their eyes, something softer, something warmer. There was no more mockery, no more scorn. Instead, there was a kind of quiet understanding. They did not need to speak. Their actions, their willingness to share the load, said everything that needed to be said. As the hours passed, Grebner found himself lost in the rhythm of the work. His hands, though calloused and rough from years of military training, moved with a certain ease as he dug into the earth. The labor was hard, the dirt cold and stubborn, but for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel the weight of his past on his shoulders. He wasn't a major anymore. He wasn't a symbol of defeat. He was just another man, another soldier, working beside the others to make the best of a situation that was beyond anyone's control. When the work detail finally broke for the day, the men sat together in the fading light, a strange quiet settling over them. Grebner found himself sitting among them, no longer isolated, no longer the object of their pity or ridicule. He was simply one of them. They spoke of the small things that occupied their lives now, the food they would be rationed, the rumors of the war's progress, the families they had left behind. There was no grand philosophy, no speeches about the futility of war. There were only the shared experiences of men who had been torn from their homes and had come to understand that survival was about far more than victory or defeat. It was about enduring, together. And in that quiet, unspoken understanding, Grebner found a kind of peace. He had lost everything. His rank, his honor, his identity as a leader, but what he had gained was something deeper, something that could not be taken away. He had regained his humanity. He had found, in the most unlikely of places, a sense of dignity, not given by the officers who once commanded him, but by the very men who had once been his enemies. The days that followed the work detail brought a subtle, but palpable shift in the atmosphere of the POW camp. The change wasn't immediate, nor was it dramatic, but it was unmistakable. Major Otto Grebner had come to realize that the silence, the quiet respect he had encountered among the British soldiers had slowly transformed into something deeper, something more human. It wasn't just the absence of mockery or the fleeting moments of acknowledgement that had made this transformation significant. It was the realization that he was no longer alone in his suffering.